Well, hello and welcome. My name is Mike. Today in this video, we are going to continue tracking with the Revised Common Lectionary, looking at one of my very favorite passages in all of the Bible, Genesis chapter 45. So grab a Bible and let's dive in. Now, this passage is just about the final scene of the story of Joseph in Genesis. So we're going to rewind and summarize how we got here. Now, Joseph is the 11th of 12 sons. He's his father's favorite and a bit of a brat as a result. His brothers get so fed up with him that they decide to kill him. And at the last minute, change their minds and instead throw him in a well and sell him into slavery. You think your family is messed up. Families in the Bible are just as broken. What a betrayal this is. Joseph's own brothers betray him. They sell him into slavery. They lie to their father, who believes that his son, his favorite son, is dead. Now, Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt, where he quickly rises up the ranks in an important official's house. I mean, sure, he's a slave and he's been betrayed by his brothers, but things could be worse. Only then he is betrayed again. There are lies told about him and he ends up in jail. So now you've got a young man who's been betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, lied about and falsely accused, and left to rot in jail. In jail, however, he makes some connections with some important people who are connected to Pharaoh. He correctly interprets the dreams of a couple of Pharaoh's servants. And so a couple years later, yes, years spent in jail, when Pharaoh has a dream, Joseph is remembered and he's called to Pharaoh. Joseph correctly interprets Pharaoh's dream, and Pharaoh makes him his number 2 in all of Egypt. It seems like Joseph has been vindicated. And it's in this important position of prominence that Joseph again meets his brothers, the ones who betrayed him and sold him into slavery. They don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. Joseph tests them, frightens them, and then in this passage, finally reveals himself to his brothers. We're picking up chapter 45, verse 3. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Now, there's no surprise. Joseph, their brother, whom they betrayed and sold into slavery, is at this point one of the most powerful men in the world. And they are 100% at his mercy. Now, the Hebrew word for terrified here or dismayed actually carries with it a sense of one being terrified in battle when confronted by a great and terrible opponent who they have no hope of overcoming. I imagine this is probably how I would have felt if I was one of the brothers with my sin brought to light, totally at the mercy of the one I had betrayed. Joseph doesn't let them remain terrified, though. Instead, in verse 4, he asks them to come close to him. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me," and they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt." I think Joseph means this both literally, that they should walk closer to him, but also figuratively, that they should come close to him, that they shouldn't remain terrified and distanced, but that they should come near to him. Joseph continues in verse 5, "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." Now, it's easy to think that this story is primarily a story about forgiveness, and it is about forgiveness, to be sure. But I think ultimately it's a story about divine providence, about how God transforms even our sin and turns it into good. The Genesis author says as much right here in verse 5, "For God sent me before you to preserve life." Joseph is reinterpreting the actions of his brothers. And as he says these words to them, he explains that although his brother's betrayal was meant for evil, that God has used it for good ends. The purpose of preserving life. Now, how is Joseph in a position to preserve life? He says it right here in verse 6. Look at this with me. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. If you're interested in learning a bit more about this famine and the prophecy associated with it, that's back in chapter 41 of Genesis. And Joseph continues in verse 7, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. Now, do you notice this? There's a repetition. Anytime there's frequent repetition in a passage, we ought to pay attention. Here, Joseph repeats himself again. God sent me before you to preserve life. We see that in verse 5 and again here in verse 7. This is worth paying attention to. Joseph is saying that it was God who sent him. He acknowledges God's sovereign hand at work, even in the betrayal of his brothers. He sees the hand of God moving things along providentially for God's own ends, namely the salvation of his people. He says it again in verse 8. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Again, with the repetition. And that is why I think this text isn't primarily about the way Joseph forgives his brothers. Because 3 times he makes a point to mention God's hand at work. And, it makes sense that this story wouldn't primarily be about Joseph forgiving his brothers. After all, the Bible isn't Joseph's story, it's God's story. And here, the author of Genesis is making clear, at least to me, that God is indeed sovereign. And Joseph, he chooses to forgive, yes. And as we'll see in a moment, he chooses to return wrongdoing with blessing. He also chooses to look back at the evil that has been done to him from a heavenly perspective, to look back and acknowledge the sovereign hand of God at work, even in the worst of circumstances. As Old Testament scholar and theologian Walter Brueggemann notes, God's purpose makes use even of the dark side of human action and planning. And then as we see in verse 9, Joseph repays the evil done to him with blessing. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay, and you shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children, your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. Goshen was a prosperous land, a good land, nothing but the best, even for those who have wronged him. Joseph continues, I'll provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And then in verse 15, he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. And so Joseph tells his brothers to bring his father and their household to Egypt immediately. Joseph can wait no longer. He wants to be reconciled, reunited, made one again. It is time. He and his family will be reunited here in Goshen, in a good land. All the bad has been worked out for good, and it is time for the family to be put back together again, to be restored. He weeps again, kissing his brothers, talking to them. Can you imagine what it would have been like for the brothers in this instance? The one they had betrayed has seemingly come back from the dead. Not only is he Lord of all Egypt, but he's standing right there before them and he's forgiving them. He's not planning to kill them, but to save them. He has forgiven them. What a moment. Can you imagine what the brothers must be feeling? The relief, the gratefulness, and then the love and the thankfulness. They don't need to live with their guilt anymore. They don't need to lie to their father anymore. They are forgiven. And all the evil has been worked together for good. It's been transformed to a new end. The one who was dead is alive and has returned to power and is Lord of all Egypt. The one they had betrayed and left for dead is showing grace and mercy. He is reconciling and restoring. They betray, Joseph forgives. It's undeserved, it's unexpected, it's utterly gracious, and it's the providential, sovereign hand of God that brings it all about. It is God bringing about the redemption of all things. And I don't know about you, but every time I hear this story, I can't help but see Jesus. Jesus, the one who was betrayed, the one who was abandoned, the one who was left for dead, the one that everyone thought was dead. Jesus, the one who comes back from the dead, that the very ones who betrayed him might be restored and brought into a good new land, who gathers those who have sinned against him into his arms, forgiven them. The sovereign hand of God working even evil for good, that he might bring about the redemption of all things. Thank you so much for joining me in this Bible study. If this was helpful for you, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.